You wake up at 3 in the morning, not from a noise, not from a dream. You are simply awake, and the room is dark, and the house is quiet. You reach for your phone, check the time, and feel that small drop in your stomach as you calculate how wrecked tomorrow is going to be. Then you lie there. Everything you have ever been told about this moment treats it as a malfunction. Something to be fixed with a cooler room, a darker curtain, less screen time, more magnesium. But for most of recorded history, waking in the middle of the night was not a disorder. It was so ordinary that it had a name. 2 names, actually. And right now, 2 academics are in a public argument in the pages of a medical journal about whether any of that is true. The names were first sleep and second sleep. The historian who dragged them back into view is A. Roger E. Kirsch, University Distinguished Professor of History at Virginia Tech. He was not looking for them. He was writing a book about night in the pre-industrial West, and he assumed sleep would be the dullest chapter in it, because sleep seemed like a biological constant, the one thing about human beings that could not possibly have a history. Then he found a legal document from 1697 from a traveling court, buried in a London records office. Somebody in a deposition mentioned their first sleep. Not as a curiosity, as a time of night, the way you might say, before lunch. Here is the pattern he reconstructed. People went to bed somewhere around 9 or 10 in the evening. They slept for a few hours. Then, sometime after midnight, they woke up and stayed awake for an hour, sometimes 2. And they did things. They prayed. They tended the fire. They talked to whoever was in the bed with them. They went outside. They visited neighbors. They thought about the dreams they had just come out of, while those dreams were still close enough to reach. One French medical manual from the 16th century advised couples that the best moment to conceive a child was not at the end of a long working day, but during that gap, after the first sleep, when both of them were rested. Then they went back to bed and slept again until dawn. The second sleep. The dream part deserves a moment because it is the detail that is easiest to test against your own experience. You almost never remember a dream from the middle of the night. You remember the ones you wake up out of. A person surfacing naturally after 4 hours of sleep is surfacing directly out of the part of the night when dreaming is heaviest, and they are then awake in the dark with nothing to do and nobody telling them to go back to sleep. Kirsch argues that this gave pre-modern people a relationship with their own dreams that we have quietly lost, not a mystical one, a practical one. They had an hour every night in which the material was still warm. Kirsch published his first paper on this in 2001 in the American Historical Review after 16 years of work. His book followed in 2005 with more than 500 references to the pattern. He has since found more than 2,000 across a dozen languages, reaching back as far as ancient Greece. Diaries, court records, medical texts, prayer books, Homer. And he has always argued that the sheer count is not the most persuasive part. The most persuasive part is the tone. Nobody in those sources explains what a first sleep is. Nobody defines it. They mention it the way you would mention breakfast, because they assumed everyone reading already knew. So what happened to it? Kirsch's answer is light. Not electric light at first, but gas. Gas lamps began lighting the streets of London in 1807, and artificial light changed the economics of the night. The evening became usable. It became a place to work, to socialize, to sell things. Bedtime slid later and later, and the night got shorter from the front end. The first sleep began expanding to fill the space. The gap in the middle narrowed. By the end of the 19th century, the second sleep had shrunk to almost nothing, a few extra minutes of turning over in bed before getting up. And light was only half of it. The other half was an idea. The same century that lit the streets also produced a new attitude toward time, in which hours were units that could be spent well or wasted, and sleep started to look like the largest waste of all. A night divided into 2 sleeps, with an hour of nothing in the middle is a night with an hour of nothing in the middle. Under the older view, that was simply what a night was. Under the new one, it was a leak. So the pattern was not only made unnecessary, it was made faintly shameful. And within a couple of generations, nobody remembered it had ever been different. That is a tidy story. And for about 20 years, it was told as settled fact. It appeared in books, in newspapers, in sleep advice, in podcasts. You have probably encountered it already. But a tidy historical story is much more convincing when biology agrees with it. And for a while, it looked like biology did. In the early 1990s, a psychiatrist named Thomas Ware was running experiments at the National Institute of Mental Health in Bethesda, Maryland. He was not studying medieval sleep. He was studying photoperiod, which simply means the amount of light in a day, and what it does to the body's internal clock. So he changed the day. His volunteers had been living, like you do, with roughly 16 hours of light. He cut that to 10. 14 hours of darkness every night for a month. Roughly what a winter night looked like before anyone could switch on a lamp. The first few nights they slept enormously, around 11 hours, almost certainly paying off a debt they had been carrying for years. And then by the fourth week, something settled. They were sleeping about 8 hours, but not in one piece. Their sleep had split into 2 blocks of roughly equal length, with a gap between them of 1 to 3 hours, in which they lay awake in the dark. The same shape. Arrived at by accident. In a laboratory by people who had never read a word about first sleep. That accident matters more than it might sound. Ware was not testing E. Kirch's theory. He had no theory about medieval bedtimes to confirm or refute, and his volunteers had no idea what they were supposed to produce. When a result turns up in an experiment that was designed to measure something else entirely, it is much harder to explain away as wishful thinking. Nobody was looking for it, so nobody could have found it by looking, and there was a detail in the blood work that made it stranger. During that middle waking period, their cortisol was low and their prolactin was elevated. Ware described the state they were in as something close to meditation, not insomnia, not distress, a kind of calm, alert stillness that nobody in a modern bedroom would recognize, because nobody in a modern bedroom gets to experience it without also looking at a clock. So now you have a historian with 2,000 references and a psychiatrist with a laboratory result, pointing in the same direction. But here's where it gets stranger. In 2023, a paper appeared in the journal Medical History with the title, "Have We Lost Sleep?" It was written by Niall Boyce, and it set out to take the whole thing apart. Boyce's first target was the experiment. Ware's study had 16 participants. That is a small number to carry the weight of a claim about all of human history. And more importantly, Boyce questioned whether sitting in a dark room for 14 hours a night is actually a simulation of pre-industrial life at all. A person in 1650 was not in a sealed chamber. They had firelight and cold and animals and work and other people breathing beside them. Boyce suggested that what the volunteers were doing might have a much simpler description than the rediscovery of an ancestral rhythm. They might just have been restless. He also pointed out that later studies conducted in more natural conditions found the internal clock shifting as expected, but did not report the same split into 2 distinct sleeps. Then he turned on the history, and this is the part that is genuinely difficult to answer. If you go into the archive already convinced that segmented sleep was universal, you will find it everywhere. Because the phrase first sleep only means what E. Kirch says. It means if you already believe the pattern was standard. Read the same documents without that assumption, and they might be describing something narrower and much more familiar. People waking in the night and not being able to get back to sleep. Not a schedule that everyone kept, a complaint that some people had. In other words, the possibility Boyce raises is that first sleep and second sleep were not the architecture of pre-modern rest at all. They were just the old vocabulary for insomnia, and that objection had already been circling. An earlier review of E. Kirch's book in a different journal made a related criticism of his method, that he tended to anthologize, that he gathered examples from across all of Western Europe, from the 16th century to the 18th, from every genre of document, and assembled them into a single picture that no individual source actually shows. Kirch responded in 2024 in the same journal. He was not conciliatory. He argued that Boyce had built a critique of his 2001 paper while largely ignoring 2 decades of work that followed it, and he restated his position that segmented sleep was the predominant pattern of the pre-industrial Western world. And then Boyce replied again and mentioned something in passing that is hard to unhear. He noted that when he first submitted his critique to the journal, E. Kirch had been one of the people who peer-reviewed it. and that Ekirch had voluntarily identified himself in a process that is normally double-blind. The historian whose life's work was being challenged had read the challenge before publication and told the author who he was. Neither man has conceded anything. The argument is still open, which means the honest answer to the question you actually care about is not the one the internet has been giving you. So what is happening to you at 3 in the morning? Nobody can tell you with certainty. Ekirch would say you are feeling an echo, a leftover from a pattern your species kept for thousands of years and abandoned in a few generations. Boyce would say the echo is all there ever was, that people have always woken in the night and that calling it a lost tradition dresses up an ordinary nuisance as ancestral wisdom. You get to sit in the gap between those two positions in the dark at 3 in the morning. But there is one thing in this story that is not disputed by anyone. The person who woke at 2 in the morning in 1650 did not know what time it was. There was no glowing number beside the bed, no arithmetic about how many hours were left. Waking up was not evidence of anything, because there was nothing to measure it against and no reason to think it meant something had gone wrong. You have all of that. You reach for the phone before you are fully conscious, and the number tells you that you are failing at something, and the failing is what keeps you awake. Whatever your body is doing in the small hours, the dread stacked on top of it is new. It arrived with the clock and the lamp and the idea that a night is a task you can either complete or fail. So the next time you wake at 3 in the morning, you will still not know whether your body is malfunctioning or remembering. But you can leave the phone where it is. The waking is old. It might be very old. The fear of it is the part your ancestors would not recognize.